Hey guys, tonight we drift across dark waters beneath a moon so thin it seems carved from bone. You probably won't survive this knot because the waves will swallow you. But because you might get so caught in the spray of salt and mystery that you forget where you began. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Drop a comment with your location and local time so we can feel the tide together. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. You stand at the prow of an ancient ship. Wind whipping foam into your hair, peering into a horizon haunted by ghostly silhouettes of oared vessels. These are the sea peoples, vanished mariners whose name only survives etched on stone tablets and scratched into Egyptian temple walls. Around 1200 BCE, Egyptian reliefs portray them as a confederation of nautical raidersmen, wearing feathered headdresses, brandishing bronze weapons, and sailing swift, shallow draft galleys. This is your first glimpse of their shadowy origins. No one knows exactly where they came from. Some scholars trace their roots to western Anatolia, pointing to coastal scrapings and pottery styles reminiscent of Mycenaean wares. Others look to the Aegean Sea's Cycladic Isles, where shell fragments and burnt ruins hint at sudden departures. Historians still argue whether these peoples were displaced refugees, fleeing internal collapse, or opportunistic warriors drawn by coastal wealth. The debate feels like chasing wisps of smoke across a dark bay. You taste salt on your lips as theories multiply. One mainstream theory suggests they were a coalition of tribes Philistines. Shurdan, Shekelesh, Pelasitich, a distinct ethnic group united by seafaring prowess. This fits the Egyptian record, which lists at least 7 names under the umbrella, sea peoples. Fringe whispers, though, claim some came from as far as Atlantis, recounting Atlantean warlords riding dolphins into battle. You can almost hear the click of flippers against oarlocks in that tale. However fanciful, as the wind shifts, you scan the horizon for landmarks. There are none knowingly endless water, and the knowledge that these raiders vanished as swiftly as they appeared. In Hittite letters from Ugarit, distant scribes mention sudden attacks. Merchant ships turned to driftwood overnight. Mainstream evidence confirms Ugarit's palace was sacked around 1190 BCE, possibly by sea people incursions. Historians still argue whether those assaults were coordinated strikes by a large federation or a series of opportunistic pirate raids. You feel the deck flex beneath your feet, imagining the groan of timber seasoned by decades of storms. Some modern enthusiasts claim sea peoples built their ships from driftwood bound by red ropes, making them near invisible on radar had radar existed. Fringe recreations even propose they painted their hulls with squid ink for stealth, though no chemical stains survive on any recovered timbers. Your curiosity drifts to the women and its children who may have sailed with these bands. Mainstream archaeology hints at entire communities on board, given the presence of cooking pits and children's pottery shards at wreck sites off Cyprus. That suggests these were not mere raiders, but migrating families seeking new homelands. Historians still argue whether the sea peoples intended permanent settlement or simply centuries-long hit-and-run campaigns. A sudden spray lashes your face as a wave collides with the stern proof that the sea never sleeps. You catch your reflection in a pool of brine, noticing how your eyes narrow against the glare. In the roar of wind and waves, you sense the cultural tumult behind each name etched in Egyptian stone. Were the Shurdan Cretans, or the Shekelesh Sicilian? Or did these designations reflect imperial scribal confusion rather than neat, ethnic labels? An unexpected light joke drifts through your mind. If they had Yelp, you imagine their reviews saying, "Great coastline, bad anchorage 10 tenths would plunder again." Get those scribes of Memphis and Thebes recorded their encounters. In deadly earnest, the land was as one burnt offering from the fury of those who came from the sea. Their temples still bear the scars of that record. You lean against a coiled rope, remembering that no Sea People chronicle survives in their own words. Everything we know comes from the states they attacked. That absence fuels our fascination. Fringe historians dream of unearthing a lost papyrus, declaring, "We are the Sea Peoples, here to crash your party." Reality, however, remains buried beneath layers of coral and ash. Historians still argue whether the Sea Peoples represented a single migratory wave or repeated influxes over decades. Some propose a domino effect. The Mycenaean collapse sent refugees west, displacing Cretan laborers who then pushed Aegean sailors into Egyptian waters. It's a convulsive chain reaction across the Bronze Age world. It's as if one coastal settlement's ruin sends shockwaves across every shore. You close your eyes for a moment, feeling the swell of the sea, not just water, but rippling echoes of entire cultures unmoored. The identity of these mariners remains concealed behind fragmentary reliefs, shattered pottery, and cryptic letters. Their name, Sea Peoples, rings out like a warning that history's greatest mysteries often emerge. From the shimmering blue where maps end, you exhale, tasting the salt temps of possibility. Tonight's journey will follow their wake, from Egypt's fortified harbors to the wind-battered shores of Anatolia, through the poetry of Canaanite ruins and the silent debris of burned acres. Keep your senses tuned for that telltale creak of oars, that flash of bronze, and remember, no matter how many stones we overturn, some secrets are meant to drift just beyond the horizon. The sea's swell carries you onward, each crest echoing like a distant drumbeat from a world unraveling. Around 1200 BCE, kingdoms toppled as if stacked cards on a stormy night. You trudge along crumbling harbor walls of Ugarit, soot still clinging to masonry, imagining a wave of chaos washing through palace after palace. This is the Bronze Age collapse, systemic breakdown of trade networks, political orders, and cultural continuity that set the stage for the Sea Peoples' maritime rampages. Mainstream history tells us that between 1250 and 1150 BCE, great states fell in rapid succession. Mycenaean palaces burned. The Hittite Empire fragmented, and Egypt's once mighty new kingdom reeled under internal strife. The linear bead tablets from Pylos record governors sent scrambling for grain as storehouses. Empty dividends of famine and economic collapse. Coastal Canaanite cities like Gaza lost their citadels, and hinterland strongholds went silent. It's as if the entire Eastern Mediterranean took a collective deep breath and then let out a catastrophic scream. Historians still argue whether these collapses were triggered by climatic droughts, seismic events, or waves of marauding invaders like the Sea Peoples. You taste ash on the breeze, an acrid reminder of conflagrations set by fleeing armies or foreign raiders. One fringe theory proposes a comet strike during this era, darkening skies and sparking panicked migrations of entire peoples. Enthusiasts point to an obscure hairline fracture in an ice core from Greenland, claiming it marks the Bronze Age. Impact, you can almost hear the celestial hump, though no crater has been reliably linked to this supposed event. It remains the kind of theory that gets whispered in planetary defense seminars and tacked on to conspiracy boards alongside Atlantis. The lights of Tyre and Sidon, once beacons of maritime commerce, blink out as supply lines collapse. Hittites, who once shipped Egyptian gold and Cypriot copper, find their vessels turning to driftwood. You step through a shattered warehouse, gingerly avoiding broken amphorae, still glinting with residue of scented oil. If you've ever been ghosted by your internet provider during a storm, you know the frustration Except now entire coastal economies vanish overnight without a signal bar in sight, inland. If you follow the dusty road to Hattusa, the Hittite capital, where palace walls reveal bas-reliefs scorched by marauders whose identity remains in question. Some tablets describe enemy ships like a desert wind overrunning the docks. Mainstream texts from Hattusa recount pleas for mercenaries from far-off landsproof. The Hittites scrambled to plug gaps in defenses too vast to hold. Historians still argue whether those pleas reflect desperation after internal revolt, or fear of a coordinated Sea People's offensive striking simultaneously at Egypt, Anatolia, and the Levant. A stray lizard scuttles across sun-baked stones, reminding you that nature reclaims ruin quickly. Fringe archaeologists claim evidence of plague mass graves aligned in neat trenches suggests disease compounded societal collapse. You picture line after line of bodies tucked away like unwanted cargo, awaiting a modern CSI-style autopsy. The more outlandish whispers even credit a sudden rat-based pandemic can ancestor of the Black, a test scuttling, unchecked through granaries. Without DNA tests on charred human remains, it's impossible to confirm. You trudge into a grove of olive trees, their gnarled roots rising like the hands of drowned sailors searching for breath. Nearby, a collapsed temple dedicated to Baal lies choked with weeds. Even these gods seem to have abandoned the human spectacle. You might have flung coins into its cistern centuries ago, praying for rain. Now you find it bone dry. Modern travelers might complain of Wi-Fi dead zones, but here, the connection to divine favor is severed for good. Amid this breakdown, trade networks fractured. Aguadi's exports of amber from the Baltic stopped as caravans refused the dangerous routes. Cyprus's copper shipments waned under pirate attacks, perhaps by Sea People's opportunists seeking metal for weapons. Historians still argue whether the Sea Peoples hunted cargo-laden ships for booty alone, or strategically targeted economic arteries to hasten collapse. You follow a battered merchant's ledger carved into stone, lists of barley sacks, tin ingots, and kill orders scribbled in fretted late Bronze Age Akkadian. Crossing out dozens of entries suggests aborted contracts. You've ever had your Amazon order canceled mid-shipment? Well, sympathize only. Here the stakes are entire nations running out of nourishment and metal for tools or armor. The coastline quivers with unease. Refuge families crammed onto overloaded galleys drift from burned city to burned city. Mainstream archaeology uncovers settlement layers nerfed by hasty abandonments. Hearths cold. Cooking pots still half full. Children's toys left behind in the panic. Historians still argue whether these migrations represent battle refugees, fleeing invading forces, or pioneers seeking new ground after failing harvests home. A light joke drifts through your mind. Imagine Bronze Age Yelp reviews. 1 star, constant screaming. No lifeboats. Would not recommend escorting entire village. Again. But levity vanishes when you peer into a makeshift encampment beneath cliffs north of Ugrit, where skeletal remains suggest abrupt catastrophe. You tense at the silent volleys of battle that once echoed here. Venturing farther west, you encounter empty harbors once busy with Cretan traders. Fishermen's huts stand vacant, nets rotting in the sun. Fringe narratives claim underwater surveys off. Crete turned up palace foundations felled by tsunamis, potentially a natural disaster in the mix. Survivors, rumor says, became the Sea Peoples themselves, forced to become raiders after losing their homes. Without clear sediment layers dated precisely to that period, we're left speculating over sonar, topography, and tsunami models. Despite the ruins, small communities cling to pockets of resilience. Inland hilltop refuges fortified their towns, tapping new water cisterns cut into stone. These enclaves survived, only to find supply lines severed as pirates prowled the coast. It's a chicken and egg scenario. Did Sea People's raids exploit An already collapsed world, or did their attacks catalyze that collapse? Historians still argue whether the Sea Peoples were the death knell of Bronze Age society or merely dragged dying states into the final abyss. You pause at a cliffside, offering a panoramic view of the Aegean. A scattered mosaic of islets shimmering in the afternoon light. Here, a lone shepherd grazes goats among broken columns. He swears he's heard tales from his grandfather about raiders who spoke a strange tongue half Mycenaean, half something else, unknown. Fringe linguists latch onto such anecdotes, chasing traces of a Sea People dialect across inscriptions with no conclusive matches. They dream of finding an alphabet carved on cliffside Stelian X script to unlock their secrets. As you stand with wind tangling your hair, you sense the full scale of the collapse, a networked world imploding like a faulty circuit board. In its cracks crept the Sea Peoples, leveraging confusion, famine, and fear to carve a niche for themselves. As the sun dips, you feel the ghostly pulse of that epoch's turmoil echoes of abandoned thrones, broken oars, and dying hearths. You lower your gaze to the shoreline below, where waves lap at shards of ceramic remnants of a world undone. Your mind drifts back to the sea's rhythm, relentless, impartial, swallowing kingdoms as easily as driftwood. Tonight, you've witnessed the broader collapse of convulsion that carved the stage for the Sea Peoples to sail into legend. Keep your ears open for the next swell, where the stories of Egypt's embattled pharaohs will come crashing into view. You step into the cool shadow of Medinet Habu's massive stone pylons, your fingertips tracing hieroglyphs carved with the precision of a jeweler setting diamonds. Flickering torches cast dancing silhouettes across the reliefs, Egyptian soldiers in pharaonic regalia clashing with helmeted strangers wielding curved swords. These are the Sea Peoples, etched into history by Ramesses III, Egypt's warrior king who turned their onslaught into propaganda that still echoes down the ages. Around 1175 BCE, Pharaoh Ramesses III staged a naval showdown in the Nile Delta, and you can almost hear the trumpets blaring amid clattering oars. Mainstream records boast that he repelled a coalition of Sea Peoples Shurdan, Sheklesh, Pelessa, Jeker, and Marambish's raiders, seeking Egyptian booty and fertile land. A vivid relief shows chained captives and piles of foreign helmets, their tall feathered crests snapped off, as if to say, "You'll never use these again." Historians still argue whether Ramesses's depiction exaggerates a minor skirmish or reflects a massive empire's threatening invasion. Your footfalls echo on the flagstones as you approach a scene of ships beached on a rocky shore. The vessels have high prows carved like bird heads. Reminiscent of swooping falcons, some fringe theorists claim these carvings represent deified sea serpents, guardians of the underworld, without any surviving Sea People's own art. It's impossible to confirm such religious symbolism. But it makes you imagine war chariots, drawn by Leviathan itself. The carved figures wear strange, armor-thick leather caps with double plumes, and scale-like skirts that chafe at your imagination. Modern reenactors have replicated these costumes, reporting blisters under their parts and dusty tans from the Sinai sun. You smirk, picturing an Instagram influencer complaining, "Today's hashtag Oudid nearly destroyed my thighs." Yet the relief shows Egyptians cutting them down like reeds, a testament to Ramesses's claim. They came in ships from the sea. Their hearts lusted after our land. You press your palm against a wall, showing the battle at sea. Tiny waves ripple beneath the hulls, and you swear you feel a cool mist, though it's just the temple's damp stone. Some fringe aficionados insist that those wave patterns encoded a secret naval calendar. But mainstream Egyptologists see them as simple, artistic conventions to represent water. Historians still argue whether these motifs reflect genuine nautical knowledge or symbolic shorthand for chaos at sea, as you descend a shallow ramp. The relief shifts to a marching force of prisoners, some kneeling with their hands bound behind their backs. The text claims Ramesses executed many by impalement, though no physical remains back up those grisly details. It's hard to know if this was rhetorical terror or actual practice. The scholars' debate feels like the Bronze Age version of arguing over clickbait headlines. You pause beneath a soaring arch, listening to the distant drip of condensation. A small niche holds a depiction of sea peoples aboard a makeshift raft. No ornate carvings, just rough planks lashed with reed ropes. Fringe blogs love this image, claiming these ragtag raiders were more akin to pirates in life rafts than organized armies. Whether they used such improvisation or deployed purpose-built galleys remains uncertain. Historians still argue whether Egypt faced a single sea people's juggernaut or myriad opportunistic groups converging on the delta. A stray shaft of sunlight falls across a cluster of glyphs listing tribute goods, copper, ivory, horses, and captives. You almost catch a whiff of incense that priests burned here millennia ago, though it's probably your imagination. One quirky anecdote credits Ramesses himself with rerouting captured sea peoples to work in Nubian gold mines, like ancient forced laborers refining the pharaoh's bling. No mine records survive to confirm this, but it's the kind of detail you'd hear whispered at late night. Archaeology conferences. You tiptoe past a depiction of cavalry charging down a bearded figure wearing a netted tunic. Some scholars speculate this represents Jeker mercenaries the Egyptians once hired, switching sides as easily as changing socks. Modern mercs might quip, "Our standard is flexible," but to an Egyptian scribe, this flip-flop was unforgivable. Historians still argue whether any sea peoples served as Hittite or Egyptian auxiliaries before turning on their former employers. Your eyes drift to a mantra carved above the battle scenes. None shall stand before the great god Ra. Thaw. Hyperbole strikes Ramesses needed this divine imprimatur to legitimize his reign. Yet a quirky fringe interpretation reads the phrase as a coded weather report claiming RA's actually signaled a sunstorm that scattered enemy ships. No meteorological data can confirm that, but it's a reminder that people long ago saw patterns where we demand proof. You lean forward, inspecting the captain of the Sheridan, a stocky warrior in horned helmet, brandishing a long spear. Historians link him to Sardinians, noting that Sheridan sounds like Chardon, an ancient name for Sardinia. Others suggest a linguistic drift from Sicilian or Sicil tribes, yet no Sardinian urns have ever turned up on the Nile Delta. Historians still argue whether these names reflect true ethnic origins or scribal mishearings of local dialects. A gentle breeze rustles through the open courtyard, an unlikely gift inside temple walls. Close your eyes and imagine the roars of battle. Clashing bronze, commands shouted, oars slamming against hulls. In that chaos, Ramesses' sculptors found time to carve an image of the pharaoh overseeing grain shipments to feed army recruits, proof that, even amid defensive warfare, supply chains mattered. It's like trying to live stream a rescue operation while managing catering. Above the entrance, a final relief shows Ramesses in triumph, offering captured sea peoples as sacrifice to Ptah. The faces of the captives are rendered with startling individuality, broad noses, jutting chins, elaborate hairdos, suggesting artistic care rather than formula. Fringe enthusiasts argue these details betray actual portraits, hinting at individualized hostages. Mainstream archaeologists caution that artistic conventions of stela carving often dictate likenesses more than real physiognomy. Historians still argue whether such reliefs capture real people or symbolic type portraits. You step back into the fading torchlight, feeling the cool stones recoil against your fingertips. Here, Ramesses III immortalized the Sea Peoples as Egypt's nearly apocalyptic adversary. Whether his inscriptions depict a true existential crisis or a carefully staged royal victory remains under scholarly debate. Yet one fact stands clear. These reliefs ensured that long after the warriors' bodies turned to sand, their names and their threat would echo across millennia. You step onto sun-baked limestone slabs overlooking a turquoise bay on Anatolia's southern coast. The Mediterranean breeze tangling your hair and carrying a tang of brine and wild thyme. Below, the waves lap at scarred ruins, half buried in sand and scrub. These crumbling walls once formed the harbor fortifications of a Hittite ally, possible early indicators of the Sea Peoples. Reach along Anatolia's shoreline. Mainstream Hittite archives from Hattusa record alarming accounts. King Tudela IV lamenting. Pirates of the sea raiding coastal towns, demanding tribute, and driving local rulers into exile. You can almost feel his panic through the dry cuneiform, carved into clay tablets. Pleas for archers and galleys to defend the southern littoral. Those letters date to around 1220 BCE, right in the build-up to wider Bronze Age turmoil. You run your fingertips over a fragment of rock inscribed with faint Hittite hieroglyphs. Archaeologists found it near Ura, a port city now swallowed by rising sea levels. One quirky theory claims this very inscription names the Luca. People frequent in Hittite texts assume some equate with the Sea People's Luca contingent. Fringe enthusiasts loudly insist that Luca secretly means people of Atlantis, sparking memes that imagine Plato's lost kingdom on the Turkish coast. Whether the Lucca sank by seismic fault or by mythical hubris remains part of the myth-making. As you wander past a mossy arch, you notice a modern graffiti tag #Anatolian ruins prayed beside an ancient relief. Tourists lean into selfies, oblivious to layers of history beneath their lenses. If you've ever tried to capture a hazy sunset on your phone, only to end up with a pixelated blur, you know the frustration of modern media failing to match lived experience. Further along the shore, you discover a semicircular wall of massive cyclopean stones jutting from scrub and rubble. Underwater surveys off this headland turned up amphora shards and ship timbers. Carbon dated to roughly 1200 BCE, mainstream researchers see this as debris from Hittite grain shipments disrupted by raiders. You dip your fingers into the shallow surf and taste iron-rich silt, proof that these waters still hold flotsam from millennia ago. Historians still argue whether those shipwrecks represent a single dramatic assault or the slow trickle of countless smaller incursions. You pause beneath a weathered relief carved into bedrock, a looped rope and/or motif, its edges softened by centuries of wind and waves. Some fringe explorers claim this symbol marks a secret lighthouse network used by the Sea Peoples to navigate treacherous shoals. Without any surviving navigational charts, it's impossible to confirm. Yet, as the sun sets and light flickers across the carving, it feels eerily plausibly like spotting runic graffiti in a subway tunnel. Moving inland, you climb a low hill crowned by squat stone bastions. A stray goat bleats in the distance, its call echoing off broken ramparts. You imagine coastal villages under Hittite protection where olive presses once turned out oil for palace lamps, now silent. One local guide whispers a legend, hidden beneath these towers is an underworld gate leading to a tunnel filled with captured spoils from raided ships, jewels, weapons, even chariots. No archaeologist has ever found that cache, but the story sparks your sense of adventure. You brush away a patch of prickly pear cactus and revealed charred timber studs embedded in the stone. Radiocarbon dating places the burn layer around 1190 BC coincident with the final push of sea peoples toward Egypt. That burn mark feels like a signature. Somebody wanted this fort burned to the ground. Historians still argue whether the incineration was carried out by coastal insurgents or as part of an internal rebellion against the faltering Hittite state. A sudden breeze carries the briny aroma of sea urchins and salt-laced air. You follow the scent to a shallow cave overlooking a narrow inlet shaded by tamarisk trees. Inside, you find scratched symbols on the walls, triangles, and circles intersecting in geometric patterns. Fringe dialectologists leap on these as evidence of a proto-alphabet used by sea peoples, though mainstream scholars dismiss them as shepherds, marks, or random graffiti. The debate resembles a modern typographer arguing over wingdings versus true script. Your stomach growls, reminding you that hungry soldiers make poor archaeologists. You recall reports of Hittite coastal garrisons provisioning troops with dried figs and barley cakes rations described in a cuneiform camp ledger discovered in Hattusa. Historians still argue whether those camp ledgers reflect active frontier outposts inundated by migrants or mere training grounds for local militias. Based on the ledger's mention of stranger tongues among recruits, you suspect a mix of locals and displaced survivors formed those defenses. You tuck into a snack from your backpack trail. Makes vaguely reminiscent of those Bronze Age barleys and figs, though with extra chocolate chips for flair. Modern logistics beat ancient supply lines by miles. Yet you can appreciate the challenge of moving provisions across rocky trails and storm-lashed coves. Imagine relying on pack donkeys to haul barley sacks while raiders lurk offshore, no GPS to guide your path. Heading toward a cluster of stunted oak trees. You reach a cliffside plateau where a dozen weathered pillars once supported a coastal watchtower. Today, they jut skyward like broken spears. From here, you peer toward the horizon, where ancient mariners might have spied approaching sail-striped cloth glinting in the sun. This vantage point feels timeless. Every wave, every breeze. A reminder that coastlines draw both commerce and conflict. Near the tower's base, you find a rusted iron object, possibly part of a long-lost sea anchor. A rope groove cuts through. Its metal, worn smooth like a well-traveled poker chip. Some fringe historians propose sea peoples invented this design, giving them superior anchoring capability. Mainstream metallurgists counter that similar anchors appear across the Bronze Age Mediterranean, suggesting shared technology rather than unique innovation. Historians still argue whether sea peoples brought novel seafaring techniques or adapted existing ones. You sink onto a flat stone, letting the Mediterranean sun warm your skin. The mosaic of ruins, before you crumbling towers, buried walls. Scattered amphora shards feels like the archaeological fingerprint of those vanished raiders. No inscriptions in their own tongue survive here. Every clue comes from enemies' records and the burned dust of destroyed sites as daylight fades. You sense how these Anatolian clues sketch an outline of the sea people's world, a shifting tapestry of coastal settlements, Hittite fears, and sporadic beachhead raids. You might not piece together their full identity, but each shard of pottery and charred wall deepens the mystery. The coastline seems to whisper, they were here once, and only once. You stand, brushing dust from your knees, and gaze westward, where the Aegean glimmers in the last light. Tomorrow, you'll follow the trail north to Mycenaean ruins, tracing how those palace collapses intersected with Anatolia's coastal upheavals. But for now, let the salt breeze carry your thoughts. Still argue whether these Anatolian ruins, mark way stations for migrating tribes or battle-scarred outposts of an empire in freefall. You wander past shattered columns and collapsed cyclopean walls, each rock slab whispering of a world undone. This is Mycenaeans' lower citadel, Once a hub of golden frescoes and ivory inlays, now reduced to rubble and dust. Around 1200 BCE, palatial. Centers from Pylos to Tyrants fell in a wave of destruction so pervasive it transformed the Aegean landscape. You probably won't survive this, not because you'll die, but because you might get so absorbed in the chalky scent of ancient plaster and broken pottery that you lose track of time. Mainstream archaeology dates Pylos's final conflagration to around 1180 BCE. Archaeologists uncovered a thick ash layer beneath burned beams. It's evidence of a palace-wide fire that razed administrative archives and kneaded clay tablets into lumps. The Linear B records cease abruptly, marking the end of Mycenaean bureaucrats tallying olive oil and chariot parts. Historians still argue whether this fire was set by inland tribes, quelling local revolts, or by seaborne raiders, possibly sea peoples sweeping down from Anatolia and the Levant. You trace your finger along a shattered amphora. It's rim-jagged, like a broken smile. Fringe theories suggest these jars once held a zesty spice blend imported from India. It's coveted by Mycenaean elites, prompting jealous cousins to torch the palace out of culinary envy. No chemical residues support cinnamon or cardamom here, but the image of spiced intrigue feels deliciously plausible in a midnight internet forum. As you step over collapsed fresco fragments, tiger striped felines once prowling painted walls, you taste chalk dust in the air, bitter and ancient. You recall reading that at Tyrants? Archaeologists found smashed ivory combs and game pieces with knocked-over pawns, hinting at a hasty siege rather than systematic dismantling. It's like pausing a board game mid-match. Someone hit conquest and ran. Historians still argue whether such haphazard scenes reflect frantic civilian flight or the calculated tactics of professional raiders. A stray goat bleats nearby, likely a modern grazer drawn to tender spring shoots through ruined gates. You laugh softly. Goats have better survival instincts than palace administrators. Stepping into what was once a megaron, you notice scorch patterns high on the walls, suggesting flames licked rafters before collapsing inward. Fringe seafaring bloggers interpret those scorch marks as signals. Sea people's lookout fires flashing in Morse-like code to lurking fleets. Without written manuals, it remains speculation. But you can imagine bearded sentries raising torches in rhythmic bursts to guide rafts through moonless nights. You wander into an open courtyard, brushing broken shards of terracotta helmets underfoot battle, debris strewn by retreating defenders. Some helmets bear unique ridges and cheek guards not typical of mainland Greek armor. Mainstream metallurgists examined fragments from Thebes and concluded they match bronze compositions from Cyprus, implying raiders recruited island mercenaries. Historians still argue whether these mercenaries were sea peoples themselves or local auxiliaries hired to fend off foreign invaders. A narrow passage leads you behind the palace, where a cistern's mouth yawns like a giant eye. Inside, you spot amphora sherds wedged in drainage channels. That desperate residents choked the outflow in hopes of drowning attackers underground. Some fringe urban spelunkers claim this tactic was coded into secret siege manuals, teaching citizens how to booby-trap water passages. No siege manual emerges, but the ingenuity reminds you that people under threat adapt quickly. You descend the hill toward the port below, where cyclopean seawalls still blot out half the horizon. There, you find cut marks on submerged Block Sainton, shipworm damage and chisel scars from dismantling stones once used in defensive bulwarks. A popular fringe video claims these marks reveal a change in shipbuilding. Sea peoples repurposed port stones as ballast for their shallow draft galleys. Whether they actually did so, or simply scoured easy building materials for refuge, is debated. Historians still argue whether port destruction was a precursor to pillage or a post-trade. Cleanup by locals scavenging salvageable stone. You pluck a piece of layered Mycenaean wall plaster. Its pigments long faded but once vivid with hunting scenes. One fragment bears an odd handprint, smeared in red oak, perhaps a ritual mark to ward off fire. Fringe theorists fancy it as the signature of a Sea People chieftain claiming conquest. But mainstream scholars view it as a protective apotropaic sign, unrelated to invaders. Legends aside, you picture fleeing families scrawling prayers on walls in hopes of divine shelter. As midday sun climbs, you find a swallow perched on a broken lintel, chirping insistently. Its tuneful song contrasts sharply with silent rubble, a reminder that life persists amid ruin. You follow its flight to a cluster of clay seal impressions, once pressed into wax on official palace documents. Some seals show unfamiliar symbols, perhaps the insignia of foreign administrators installed after conquests. Historians still argue whether these seals signal a brief Sea People's occupation or the rise of opportunistic warlords breaching palace. Security dot your footsteps, crunch along pebble-strewn floors, drawing you toward a collapsed side room where fresco fragments depict crowned figures receiving gifts. One hand, painted with black outline, gestures upward as if bestowing authority. Fringe art historians have hypothesized this scene represents a cession treaty between Mycenaeans and Sea Peoples, an early tribute for peace deal. Without decipherable inscriptions, we're left to imagine whether those gestures mark subjugation or polite diplomacy. You lean against a fallen column and let out a soft sigh, brushing sand from the base. In the stillness, you almost hear the clash of bronze swords and the wail of trumpets announcing Sea Peoples arriving in beaked ships. Yet each piece of pottery and each scorched beam remains mute, offering only tantalizing clues. The Aegean palaces fell through a tangled web of motives: economic strain, internal revolt, and possibly opportunistic raids. Historians still argue whether the Sea Peoples caused these collapses directly or simply exploited. Society's already on the brink. You rise and gaze back at the horizon where sky meets sea, imagining fleets of carved wood galleys slicing through waves toward waiting shores. The Aegean destruction layers sketch a ghostly map of upheaval, a blueprint for understanding the Sea People's impact beyond Egypt. But the palaces' ruins also remind you that history often writes itself in ash and stone, needing only the right flood of invaders or the right famine or quake to turn order into chaos. You lean over the rail of a shallow draft galley, feeling the spray of Mediterranean foam sparkle like diamond dust on your eyelashes. Below, oars slice the water in steady rhythm, a chorus of wood and muscle, carrying you toward unguarded shores. This is the Sea People's signature tactic. Swift ships designed for surprise landings, where a handful of warriors could slip past bulky naval blockades and appear on sandy beaches before anyone realized the raid had even begun. Mainstream history tells us their vessels were double-hulled liners, narrow enough to slip through shallow bays and broad enough to carry raiding parties' whole families, livestock, and bronze-bound treasure chests in tow. Egyptian reliefs at Medinet Habu show these ships as low-slung craft, oars protruding from square cutouts along the hull, with a single mast and square sail ideal for coasting with the wind and pushing a priver under or power. Historians still argue whether these designs were borrowed from Cretan traders or innovated by the raiders themselves during their long voyage westward. Under the sway of your galley, scan the coastline ahead. It's a rocky promontory crowned with olive groves and dotted with ruins, likely an outpost abandoned in the Bronze Age collapse. The raiders would choose a site like this for its hidden coves and limited sightlines. You can almost hear their commanders whisper instructions. Unload at the cove's shadow, then fan out inland before dawn. That element of stealth defined their naval warfare, not epic sea battles, but lightning-quick strikes that left defenders scrambling. A fringe theory insists the sea peoples painted the undersides of their hulls with squid ink at night, rendering them invisible in moonless waters. You imagine paddling up a black phantom ship, oars whispering through inky depths like underwater katana blades. Of course, no marine archaeology has detected squid residue on recovered wrecks, but the notion adds a deliciously noir flavor to their operations. Think ancient maritime ninjas. The galley's plank deck creaks underfoot as you follow a raider wielding a bronze-tipped harpoon. He mutters about using the harpoon's spike, not just for fish, but for ripping holes in enemy hulls. Mainstream finds include puncture marks on Canaanite hull timbers, consistent with small-scale ramming techniques. Historians still argue whether those ramming scars signify organized naval engineering or improvisational sabotage by opportunistic fighters. You taste salt and iron on the wind and realize the sea peoples mastered amphibious tactics. One moment they're skeletal shadows disappearing over the horizon. The next, you spot spikes of driftwood arranged in the shallows, a crude underwater obstacle meant to damage pursuing ships. Fringe explorers claim such traps were deployed around Nile River mouths, slowing Egyptian galleys while raiders regrouped on shore. Primary sources are silent on these wooden booby traps, yet the ingenuity feels entirely in character. On deck, a sentry points toward a faint flicker of torchlight. In a nearby cove, likely a small fishing hamlet bustling with unsuspecting families. You imagine the raiders lowering boats and drifting silently like shadows, each man clutching a spear rather than a paddle, ready to strike before dawn. A light joke crosses your mind. Imagine your Uber Eats driver arriving with demands for your best goats and olive oil. But here, the stakes were far higher than delayed dinner. The galley glides into the cove's mouth, oars lifted and stowed. Silence takes over, broken only by muted splashes as warriors step into ankle-deep water. You feel the tension not in your stomach. It's just like binge-watching a heist thriller only. There's no rewind if things go wrong. A raider raises his hand in a swift signal. 2 pulses for advance, 3 for flank. Modern SEAL teams study similar hand signals for beach insertions. Perhaps the Bronze Age had its own semaphore. You step ashore, toes sinking into fine sand warmed by the previous day's sun. The raider in charge glances at you, his helmet adorned with a single curved horn, a decorative flourish said to strike fear into locals. Fringe art historians link this horned helmet style to Sardinian iconography, suggesting cultural fusion amongst sea peoples' ranks. Without heartland, Sardinian artifacts found in eastern Mediterranean sites, that link remains speculative. Historians still argue whether horned helmets signified a core ethnic group or were merely battlefield fashion. Sand clings to your ankles as you watch the raiders fan out, slipping between palm groves toward mud brick huts. Their swift disembarkation mimics modern fast roping from helicopters, only here it's beach landings from wooden galleys. The psychological advantage was immense. Defenders saw no large warships, only a handful of shadowy figures materializing in the half-light. A sudden sound, a goat bleeding too close to the shore, triggers the raiders' disciplined response. 2 arrows arc into the sky, pinning the animal to a hut's frame, silencing the alarm. Mainstream evidence from Canaanite sites includes arrowheads lodged in walls above doorways, indicating these raiders trained for precise, non-lethal strikes to suppress early warnings. Historians still argue whether this specialized archery represented a proto-special forces unit or ad hoc training, by seasoned hunters among their ranks. You crouch behind a rock and taste the tang of fear in your mouth, mingling with the brine. A raider kneels, using a shell to scratch symbols into the sand, their own crude map of the shoreline and hidden reefs. Fringe theorists propose this was an early form of navigational chart, encoding safe passages and ambush points. Well, no. Surviving Sea Peoples map has been discovered. Similar sand-sketched maps persist in oral seafaring traditions across Melanesia, suggesting parallel methods could have existed. As raiders secure the beachhead, your galley slips away, silent again. Under an oarless night, you watch only the faint glow of campfires flicker through palm fronds before the darkness swallows it. In the distance, the cove's fisherfolk awakened to clashing bronze and shouted, "Ordurza!" Jolt, no coastal warning system could mitigate. Later, you climb back aboard and run your hand across the hull's smooth planks, feeling the memory of that stealth insertion. The captain points to crossed spears carved near the Boan emblem borrowed by some sea peoples to mark conquered shores. Fringe lecturers label this the Sea Peoples graffiti, kin to ancient tagging. But mainstream scholars caution that spear carvings appear in multiple cultures as generic war symbols. Historians still argue whether these marks signified unit identity or general threat warnings. You settle onto a coiled rope, listening to the oars slip back into motion as your galley slips into open sea. The hushed paddling resumes, each stroke pushing you farther from the raided cove and back into deeper waters. Above, the night sky spins a vault of constellations you can't quite place, just as the Sea People's true names elude history in that hush. You sense why naval tactics defined their success by avoiding pitched sea battles and instead using speed, surprise, and intimate coastal knowledge. They turned the Mediterranean into their playground. Their ships were extensions of their wilt holes, for sowing fear rather than summoning armies. As you drift under starlight, you realize this is the core of their maritime legacy. Not might, but magic, the sudden, inexplicable arrival of invaders from nowhere. You crouch in a low-lit chamber where clay tablets rest on reed mats, surfaces etched with neat cuneiform lines that catch the lamp's flicker like whispering tongues. This is Tel El Amarna, the Egyptian capital where princes and city rulers exchanged urgent letters. Around 1350 BCE, Amarna scribes recorded pleas from coastal Canaanite kings, complaining of pirate-like raids on their harbors, an eerie prelude to the Sea Peoples. Later onslaughts, you lift a tablet addressed to Pharaoh Akhenaten, its edges rough under your fingertips. The Prince of Tunip begs for military aid, lamenting that ships of the Great Sea strike each dawn, carrying slingers and swords who consume our fields. That's your mainstream fact. The Amarna letters include dozens of pleas, referencing pirate ships disrupting trade, proof that seaborne raiders plagued the Levant centuries before the Bronze Age collapse. Historians still argue whether these early raids involved Proto-Sea Quipos bands or were confined to local corsairs taking advantage of Egypt's shifting focus. Faint whiff of bitumen from the resin used to seal the tablet lingers in the air, mingling with the temps of limestone dust. Can almost taste that resin's acrid sweetness, like biting into a burnt candle. Fringe scholars point to a peculiar phrase in one letter. They came draped in eelskins and spoke in voices like seabirds, quirky. Absolutely, but no one has found physical evidence of eelskin cloaks or a seabird dialect. You smile at the image of cloaked marauders squawking as they row. But it underscores how desperate correspondents reached for vivid metaphors in diplomacy across the chamber. Another tablet replays like a sorrowful song. King Ribahata of Byblos moans, "My ships lie broken, my trade partners silenced. The sea kingdom devours my livelihood." Can almost hear the crash of waves, can shattered hulls as you imagine this coastal trade hub reduced to ramshackle docks. That tension between commerce and conflict defined Amarna diplomacy. Incense caravan routes disrupted by stranger sails, and oil merchant families left destitute. You brush a wisp of hair from your face, feeling the heat of wall lamps, carrying the sharp scent of ghee. The room's hush presses in, punctuated only by a squirrely rat skittering across broken pottery. You half expect an envoy to burst in, breathless, clutching a fresh missive announcing another siege. Instead, you find a fragmentary tablet listing tribute shipments, copper for weapons, cedar logs for shipbuilding, and precious lapis lazuli for royal tombs. This tablet suggests raiders targeted strategic materials, not just food stores. Historians still argue whether those demand lists represent forced levies by raiders or negotiated tributes from frightened city-states. A slender wall niche holds a stylus soaked in reed ink so dark it resembles spilled night. You imagine scribes scribbling in candlelight, translating local panic into diplomatic code. A light joke flits through your mind. If they'd had Gmail, you'd find Rust Belt entrepreneurs complaining about sea peoples in your spam folder. Your docs are under siege. Open immediately to negotiate safe passage. One letter, unusually optimistic, hints at a rare ceasefire. Send us archers, we will pay in wheat. We beg only that the sea watchers relax their grip. That suggests some coastal towns tried striking deals paying raiders to spare them. Fringe theories inflate these offers into proto-mercenary contracts, as if city-states hired sea peoples as navies. No contract scroll survives, but it'd make a compelling reality show bids and brigands of the Bronze Age. You follow the burning wick of your lamp to another tablet glued back from shards. Its scribe describes tall figures with earrings like shells boarding ships at night. Mainstream translators debate whether shell earrings mistranslated, a term for bronze rings or a literal fashion detail. Historians still argue whether these descriptions refer to seafaring tribes already present in the Aegean or two roving bands coalescing into the Sea People's Confederation decades later. Outside, a call of a night bird cuts through your concentration, perhaps an owl peering in through a cracked wall. It reminds you that scribes often worked under torchlight until dawn. Eyes red, translating coastal chaos into entreaties for military support. You wonder how Pharaoh received these letters. Did he set them in order of urgency, or let them pile until his vizier could no longer ignore the economic disruption? On a side table, you spot a small reed basket holding tokens, shell fragments, copper ingots, and a single lion's fang gifts, sometimes sent as diplomatic markers. Comments in the margins suggest Egypt's court sometimes rewarded coastal rulers with archers and scorpion charioteers to guard harbors. That intervention echoes centuries later in Ramesses III's campaigns. Historians still argue whether Egypt's waning resources by 1200 BCE prevented an effective seal of the Levantine coast, allowing sea peoples to slip through gaps in defense. You lean closer to decipher a rubric stating length of day to build. Walls, 10 cubits. It hints that some cities planned rapid fortification upon hearing of raider movements. Archaeologists uncovered hastily built ramparts at Tel Fakaria, showing multiple construction layers and imprint of reactive defense. Fringe archaeologists claim they found an emergency trench system coded into the city's original design. But mainstream experts see it as piecemeal repairs. It's not preemptive fortifications. The chamber's shadows elongate as you turn a corner and find a small scribal desk cluttered with abandoned tablets. One block bears a single hieroglyph, a coiled snake beside a wave possibly marking sea serpent raids. This motif surfaces in some Bronze Age iconography, though its meaning remains elusive. Fringe mythographers spin it into a sea people's sea dragon cult, speculating that raiders worshipped marine beasts. Without temples or liturgy, that image remains mythic. Yet it enriches the tapestry of speculation. You rise and step back into the corridor, cradling a tablet that trembles faintly under your grip. Outside the scribal house, You can almost hear the distant lapping of the Nile's canals, a reminder that Egyptian lifelines depended on unimpeded trade. Those canals, too, eventually felt the squeeze of seaborne threats, a preview of the larger invasions to come. You pause at a fresco of Pharaoh's emissary riding a chariot flanked by archers, eyes fixed on the horizon. It symbolizes Egypt's resolve to protect coast and convoy. That resolve waned over decades, and by 1200 BCE, the naval brakes failed, inviting the full fury of the sea peoples. Historians still argue whether earlier Amarna interventions could have altered the later trajectory, or if larger forces, climate, famine, internal revolt rendered defense efforts moot. A stray breeze through the open gateway stirs reed mats and sends a ripple through hanging tapestries. You feel the echo of scribes past, translating maritime mayhem into urgent pleas. These Amarna letters serve as the earliest diplomatic record of seaborne predation, halfway between local piracy and full-scale invasion. They offer tantalizing glimpses at the developing patterns of coastal raids that the sea peoples would perfect decades later. You step back, setting the tablet gently on its shelf. As you leave the chamber, you carry the weight of those ancient words, handwriting that bridged panic and policy, ink turning chaos into counsel. Tonight, you've heard the diplomatic echoes of the sea people's rise, a network of letters pleading for help, mapping early roots of fear and subjugation. In the hush of the corridor, you almost expect the cuneiform to whisper one last warning: guard the coast, or the sea will guard itself. You step onto a windswept promontory where jagged rocks plunge into a roiling sea, and the wind carries whispers of ancient myths woven around those mysterious raiders. Local fishermen still spin yarns about long-haired warriors materializing from storm-lashed waves, their skins glistening with brine and scales. These are the sea peoples of legend, part human, part beast, stories that shimmer between history and myth, like sunlight on surf. Mainstream accounts reveal that coastal scribes sometimes describe these invaders with inhuman traits. Ugaritic texts refer to rebels of the sea as half-serpent, half-man creatures, their coils uncoiling through harbor waters to drag oarsmen to their doom. Historians still argue whether such descriptions reflect real combat horror soldiers drenched in seaweed or poetic exaggeration to dramatize raids. You taste salt on your lip as you imagine those first sightings. Terrified coastal guards glimpsing shapes more fluid than flesh. Fringe folklore from Cyprus insists the Sheridan were exiled demigods, descendants of Poseidon's brood, punished for hubris and banished to wander the Mediterranean's fringes. According to one eccentric island tale, these demigods taught mortals shipbuilding in exchange for worship, then turned on their disciples when the offerings dwindled. You can almost see them crowned in coral, tridents glinting under a moonlit sky, only disappearing with a thunderclap as priests pleaded for reprieve. No temple inscriptions back up this theory, but the image persists in tavern chatter and late-night podcasts. You recall Medinet Habu's reliefs showing Sheridan captives in horned helmets, sleeve armor, glinting bronze. Some myth makers interpret those helmets as ceremonial crowns, marking their divine descent rather than mortal warriors. They claim carvings of feathered headdresses depict ancestral wings, suggesting these raiders flew on wind gusts before alighting on sand. Modern reenactors joke that if they'd had hot air balloons, the sea peoples would have skipped the ships altogether. Bronze Age ballooning. In Phoenician lore, the Pelasatophan equated with Philistines were cursed fish people who rose each new moon to claim coastal towns. Their emblem, a wave curling into a crescent, appears on coastal amulets found in Acre and Ashkelon. Mainstream archaeologists uncovered dozens of these tokens, likely meant to ward off raids. Historians still argue whether the crescent wave motif belonged to raiders themselves or to locals who adapted it into protective charms. You wander to a cliffside shrine where villagers leave scraps of fish and bread offerings to appease the sea lords they believe linger offshore. Fringe spiritualists claim these offerings reflect an unbroken ritual handed down by survivors of sea people's raids. They hold circle ceremonies at dawn, chanting, "Spirits of hull and oar, bless our nets." No written continuity exists, yet the ritual's persistence feels like a thread connecting past to present. A quirky anecdote from a 19th century British traveler describes a cyclotic fisherman convinced that sea peoples once rode dolphins into battle. According to his journal, an aged mouth carved sea riders into a rocky cove, claiming his grandfather saw men astride porpoises charging shore. You raise an eyebrow at the imaging ancient manatees with saddle straps, and wonder if it's simply a sunstroke vision or a creative local mocking gullible visitors. You trace the coastline with your praise sea hall. You trace the coastline with your gaze, thinking of the Shurden and Shekelesh listed side by side in Egyptian inscriptions. Some mythic genealogies claim these groups intermarried and spawned a race of oceanic giants who haunted the Aegean's hidden coves. They say the giants' footprints still imprint on coastal rocks, deep hollows that fill with water at high tide. Modern hikers call them sea troughs, attributing them to wave erosion. Historians still argue whether they're natural formations or ancient footprints immortalized by legend in a ruined Hittite coastal fortress you explored earlier. Locals pointed out a shallow pool engraved with concentric circles, believed to be the pool of remembrance, where survivors saw visions of lost kin. Fringe mystics interpret the circles as portals to the undersea realm, connecting living and drowned sea peoples, without any Hittite text referencing such pools. The tale remains a tantalizing possibility lodged between myth and memory. As dusk falls, you light a single lamp beneath a rock overhang, admiring faint graffiti. A serpent coiled around an oar, its head crowned with a sun disk. Some scholars interpret the disk serpent motif as a solar boat common in Egyptian iconography, adopted by coastal scribes to demonize raiders as anti-sun deities. Historians still argue whether these images represent enemy propaganda or genuine syncretism of Mediterranean myths. You taste the tang of evening air and recall Ugarit's lamentation poems, where bards sing of sea children born of ocean mist, with voices echoing gull cries. No fragments of these poems survive, save tantalizing references in later Greek texts, which borrow similar imagery for Triton and Nereid stories. That poetic lineage suggests sea people's myths wove into broader Mediterranean lore, shaping legends of sea nymphs and monstrous mariners. Fringe comparative mythologists spin this into a theory that Homer's Odysseus actually battled sea peoples, Cyclops. But most agree that epic conflations obscure more than they clarify. A sudden breeze sends shivers through your shirt as you peer into the moonlit bay. You half expect to see dark shapes slipping across the water's surface, hearing the echo of bronze clashing against rock. Instead, only lapping waves answer, indifferent to human drama. In that hush, you understand why mythical narratives grip us. They fill gaps where history remains silent, painting the unknown with strokes of terror and wonder. You stand, brushing sand from your knees, and feel the myths settle around you like salt-laden mist. Whether born of travelers, tall tales, poetic license, or genuine encounters with shadowed raiders. These legends remind you that the sea peoples were more than marauders. They embodied the ancient sea's inexplicable power. Historians still argue whether myth and memory ever converge on truth. But in the swirl of spray and story, you glimpse how these narratives kept the sea peoples alive long after their ships vanished beyond the horizon. You step into a sandy cove where shards of blackened timber and bronze fittings litter the tide line, remnants of the sea people's ever-evolving toolkit. Weathered planks, bleached by sun and salt, crumble beneath your boots as you survey the technology these mariners wielded, innovations that turned simple raids into precision operations and left coastal defenses scrambling to catch up. Mainstream archaeology confirms that the raiders favored long, slender swords with leaf-shaped blades. Unearthed examples from Ashkelon show a neatly tapered point ideal for thrusting through chainmail gaps, proof that these fighters prized agility over brute force. Historians still argue whether these swords originated in Cyprus metallurgical workshops or were forged by displaced Mycenaean smiths perfecting designs in exile. You pick up a small fragment of a curved dagger, its edge still sharp under your thumbnail. Fringe collectors gush online about frost-iron daggers, hardened by dipping the blade into mountain snow. Molten alchemical rumor with no metallurgical basis. Can almost see a raider plunging the dagger into icy water at dawn, creating dragon's steel before morning patrols began. Real analyses indicate standard Bronston ratios, but the legend sizzles with midnight forged allure, alongside swords. The Sea Peoples sported distinctive helmets, bowl-shaped with a low crest and flared cheek guards, a rare find at a submerged wreck off Cyprus reveals a helmet adorned with concentric ridges, perhaps to deflect glancing blows. Modern reenactors liken this style to a mini medieval sundial, because the ridges cast sharp shadows on polished bronze. Yet those ridges may have served a practical purpose, strengthening the dome and adding deflection angles. Historians still argue whether such ridged helmets evolved locally or were imports from Anatolia. Your fingers brush against a pile of corroded arrowheads, lightweight and slender, each one balanced for maximum velocity. Some examples bear barbed sockets, making extraction painful and ensuring wounded foes couldn't easily escape. The sophistication suggests raiders prioritized disabling scouts and sentries to sow fear. Fringe blogs tout the idea that poisoned arrowheads lurked among these finds, dipped in toxic plant extracts. No toxin residue survives on museum-pitched specimens, yet the theory endures in late-night herbalism forums. Scattered among weapon remains, you notice lengths of rope woven from plant fibers. The Sea Peoples learned to splice and coil ropes into grappling hooks, allowing raiding parties to scramble up sheer walls at night. Mainstream experiments at maritime heritage sites confirm that well-tied rope hand hook systems could scale fortifications with surprising ease, particularly in the still of early hours. Historians still argue whether these grappling assaults were routine practice or last resort tactics. When gates refuse to yield, nearby lie broken timbers bearing claw-like iron fittings, remnants of boarding hooks used to snag enemy vessels. You imagine raiders swinging these hooks to latch onto hulls, hauling themselves aboard like waterborne vines. One quirky anecdote from a 19th century travel diary describes locals discovering a rusted hook tipped with a seahorse motif, perhaps a personal emblem or ward against drowning. Whether that motif held superstitious weight or was simply decorative remains uncertain. You step onto a flat expanse rimmed by a semicircle of coral-bleached white, a makeshift dry dock, where raiders maintained their vessels between campaigns. Here, you find wooden framing scars carved into bedrock, where ships were refastened with birch tar caulking to seal planks. Mainstream nautical reconstructions show that birch tar, combined with animal fat, created a surprisingly flexible sealant, keeping seawater at bay. Historians still argue whether landing crafts needed frequent recaulking, or if Sea Peoples simply preferred quick repairs before next departures. You bend to examine a metal ring embedded in a slab, a single iron ferrule set into stone, used as a mooring tie-off for landing smaller boats. Fringe conspiracy posts claim these rings mark secret mooring spots known only to Sea Peoples. Hidden away from local fishermen's maps, Yet maritime archaeologists note that similar mooring rings appear at Phoenician and Mycenaean ports, suggesting shared coastal infrastructure rather than exclusive bandit hangars. Eeling through rusted buckets, you uncover clay cooking pots ringed with metallic residues of portable forges briefly set up on shore. Raiders may have sharpened blades or repaired hooks using small bellows and charcoal, forging simple tools in hidden coves. That's your mainstream fact. Field forges appear in Hittite camp inventories, showing that portable metalwork was an ordinary feature of Bronze Age armies. Historians still argue whether sea peoples carried forges by default or relied on captured workshops in coastal settlements. You notice mounting brackets embedded in a rubble-strewn wall, evidence of pulley systems used to hoist ships clear of water for hull maintenance. Some fringe experimental archaeologists claim that raiders deployed capstan-like contraptions, 2 lifter boats by dozens of men at once, citing isolated rock carvings as proof. No direct text describes such capstans, but the carvings' circles with spokes hint at mechanical ingenuity beyond tools and weaponry. The Sea Peoples engineered ship designs tailored for surprise. Their vessels featured open decks for rapid disembarkation and low freeboard to make boarding from the waterline easier, details visible in reliefs at Medinet Habu. These ships traded heavy superstructures for speed and stealth. Historians still argue whether they evolved from Cretan traders' craft or were hybrid designs melding Anatolian and Aegean hull forms. You trail your hand along an iron prow, fitting still bolted to a chunk of keel. Some versions sported ornately cast bronze ram, head small, but potent for slicing into enemy hulls at speed. Others reveal sharpened timber prows used for shallow water ramming and beaching. Fringe enthusiasts marvel at claims that Sea Peoples practiced ram drills in hidden lagoons, but no practice timbers survived to confirm. A quick joke flits through your mind. If they'd had inflatable pontoons, raiders would have left the beach for good. Instead, they pivoted on solid hulls and aggressive tactics, showing that practical innovation often beats utopian gadgets. Their blend of welding simple mechanics with borrowed designs made them formidable pirates and raiders who kept adversaries guessing. You close your eyes and taste brine-laden air, envisioning those raiders fitting last arrowheads into bamboo quivers, dousing repair fires, and adjusting sail hoists for wind shifts. Their technology was less about groundbreaking invention and more about adaptability, repurposing local tools, scavenging materials, and evolving designs on the move. This open-source approach turned every raid into a live-fire prototype session. You stand, stepping over a final cluster of rusted nails and spikes, and cast a long glance across the cove. The scattered remnants of bronze and wood mark the Sea People's technological footprint, a mosaic of borrowed skills and on-the-fly problem-solving. No single artifact tells the full story, but together they reveal a people who weaponized practicality and surprise. Historians still argue whether these innovations spread to later Mediterranean navies or died out with the Bronze Age world. Yet, as you walk away, you feel that the Sea People's lasting contribution was a lesson in making the most of what washes ashore. You skirt the edge of a ruined city where mosaic tiled floors lie shattered under thorn brush and blackened walls gape like broken teeth. This was a Gurit, once a thriving port of towering palaces and wharves, now a skeletal husk smothered in ash. Around 1190 BCE, an intense blaze consumed its palace archives, leaving only charred clay tablets among collapsed beams. That conflagration stands as a textbook case of Sea People's linked city destruction. Sudden, thorough, and devastating. Historians still argue whether Sea People stormed Ugrit directly or merely exploited internal strife to torch the city. You pick your way through scorched doorways, inhaling the acrid tang of burnt resin long soaked into doorposts. Mainstream. Excavations uncovered levels of destruction sandwiched between earlier, earthquake debris that Ugarit endured both natural tremors and human fury. One layer shows fires licking ceiling frescoes, another collapsed limestone blocks. Archaeologists date that upper burn layer precisely to the Sea Peoples era, linking the raid to coastal invaders rather than tectonic drama. A fringe anecdote insists the raiders employed primitive Greek fire incendiary pressed from resin and bitumen to ignite oil stores and send flames skittering across courtyards. No residue of petrochemical mixtures has been found. But the story fits the dramatic image of walls flaming like funeral pyres. If true, it would mark an early instance of chemical siegecraft. Yet mainstream scholars regard Greek fire at Ugora as a fanciful tale spread by medieval chroniclers, not a Bronze Age reality. You taste grit on your tongue as you duck beneath a fallen lintel into what was once the throne room. Scrawled on a collapsed pillar are charcoal stick figures, soldiers brandishing spears. Fringe enthusiasts dream these are doodles left by terrified scribes, but most experts chalk them up to modern graffiti or drainage charcoal. Historians still argue whether any authentic panic art exists among Ugarit's ruins or if our imagination fills the gaps. Out in the open courtyard, you find shattered tombs strewn like tombstones marking each point of impact from battering rams or axes. Some jars bear axe marks so deep they cut through handles, suggesting methodical looting of wine and oil stores before burning. Mainstream studies confirm that Sea Peoples targeted such essentials pillaging olive presses and wine vats to cripple both economy and morale. Historians still debate whether these raids aimed primarily at plunder or at systematically dismantling a rival polities. Lifeblood. Stepping over broken column drums. You stumble on a cluster of child-sized small leather shoes preserved in bitumen-coated earth. Archaeologists interpret these as evidence of a hasty evacuation. Families dragged from homes with little time to gather possessions. Fringe storytellers spin heart-rending tales that these belong to palace pages forced into exile, but mainstream experts caution that without human remains, the sandals could just as easily be offerings or ceremonial items dropped in panic. Historians still argue whether personal artifacts like these represent fleeing refugees or ritual deposits. You find a deep pit where the city's granary once stood. Its stone walls bear scorch patterns and tool marks from hurried excavation. Mainstream excavators uncovered pockets of burned barley grains, mixed with charcoal, proof that attackers aimed to starve survivors by burning stored food. Some historians suggest this indicates strategic famine warfare, while others argue that fires spread uncontrollably, consuming warehouses indiscriminately in the chaos. Historians still argue whether famine tactics were deliberate scorched earth, policy, or collateral damage. Beyond Ugarit, you ride along the Levanten coast to Ashkelon, where city gates have collapsed into dunes. Here, too, a distinct destruction. Layer of roof tiles and collapsed fortifications dates to the early 12th century BCE. Mainstream epigraphy records. Local governors pleading for Egyptian reinforcements, implying that Ashkelon fell under the same raid wave that consumed Ugarit. Scholars found arrowheads in gate timbers, some matching Sea Peoples' barbed designs. Historians still debate whether these were defending forces firing back or offensive raiders spiking the gates. A quirky discovery in Ashkelon's eastern quarter shows charred remains of a leather-bound chest. Inside, archaeologists recovered decorative bronze fittings and a handful of faience beads. The chest had been locked, suggesting hurried defenders stowed valuables before escape. Fringe treasure hunters fantasize that the Sea Peoples looted and dispersed these chests across the Mediterranean, but no matching artifacts have surfaced elsewhere. Historians still argue whether Ashkelon's loot was spirited away or simply consumed in the fire. You climb the rubble of Ashkelon's main temple, where a lintel bearing a carved bull's head, once a protective deity, now lies face down in sand. The temple's fire-blackened sanctum hints at sacrilegious destruction, as raiders often desecrated religious centers to break communal spirit. Mainstream interpretation holds that desecration was both punitive and symbolic, sending a message that no power divine or mortal could save the city. Historians still argue whether such sacrilege was routine for peoples or a localized expression of rage. Between Ugarit and Ashkelon, dozens of smaller harbors Jaffa, Jo, similar destruction strata, charred beams, collapsed watchtowers, scorched storerooms. In these lesser sites, however, some settlements survived by negotiating tribute payments. One shoreline site displays a layer of unlooted amphory, suggesting raiders accepted payments and moved on without burning the town. That dual-pattern destruction or extortion hints at a calculated campaign rather than random looting. Historians still debate whether sea peoples operated under unified command or as independent bands, making local choices. You find a stretch of coast where burned tree trunks olive and tamarisk line the beach like charred sentinels. Mainstream pollen analysis shows a sudden drop in olive groves around 1180 BCE. Evidence of large-scale plantation burning. Some scholars view this as collateral damage, while others infer that raiders deliberately torched groves to undermine long-term agricultural recovery. Historians still argue whether the destruction of landscape resources was strategic, environmental warfare, or incidental consequence of city raids. A sudden breeze kicks up dust in the shattered ruins and you taste ash on your tongue. You pause where a lone stone bench overlooks the bay, once a vantage for city sentries. Now only gulls wheel overhead, indifferent to past human drama. The urban collapses of Ugarit, Ashkelon, and their coastal neighbors reveal a pattern. People's raids delivered swift, brutal blows that toppled civic life, disrupted economies, and extinguished sacred spaces. Whether these attacks represent a coordinated naval invasion or a series of opportunistic strikes remains contested. The charred ruins speak of a people whose arrival spelled instant apocalypse. As you leave the beach, you carry the heavy quiet of destroyed cities with shattered thresholds that mark the sea people's most tangible legacy. These ruins remind you that beyond myths and tactics, the true measure of their power lies in the ruin they left in their wake. You crest a low dune, leaving behind the charred ruins of coastal cities as the wind whips salt spray into your hair. Below stretches a jagged coastline once crisscrossed by fleets of sea peoples: Shurden, Shkalesh, Peliset, Jeker, Danayan. Lucca names etched in Egyptian and Hittite records like a litany of maritime phantoms. Now comes the trickiest question. Who were these shadowy raiders? Mainstream scholarship often groups them into displaced refugees from the collapsing Mycenaean world. Pottery styles found in Canaanite wrecks match late Helladic wares, suggesting Aegean origin. Some argue that the Danayan were the Danaans of Homeric fame, wandering sailors cast adrift after palace destructions. Historians still argue whether those pottery matches indicate entire communities migrating or simply opportunistic traders turned corsair. As you pick your way through shell-strewn sand, you spot a small shard painted in deep blue, a hallmark of Minoan artisans. Fringe theorists leap on such fragments, proclaiming the sea peoples as Cretan exiles fleeing volcanic fury on Thera. They imagine white-robed Minoan priests turned warrior kings, bearing Labrys axes into battle. No volcanic ash layer ties the settlers to 1200 BCE stranding. Yet the image of saffron-scented cultists armed with bronze tomahawks persists at late night. Archaeology panels. Turning your gaze westward, the Sheridan's proposed Sardinian roots draw you next. Bronze Age Sardinia's bronze statuettes echo the Sheridan's horned helmets carved at Medinet Habu. Modern analysts note that Sardine local tongue means armored one. Hinting at a linguistic link, historians still debate whether Sheridan inscriptions truly mirror Sardinian epigraphy or if Egyptian scribes simply misheard tribal names. You trudge along the shoreline, thinking of the Shekelesh and the Shekelesh-Sicels debate. Some see a tie to Sicily's prehistoric inhabitants, the Sicels, whose hilltop towns fell to Dorian migrations. Fringe bloggers even claim those Sicels wore gold laurel wreaths, like early Romans. An archaeological unicorn unsupported by any tomb finds. The more conservative view places Shekelesh in Cilicia, conflating them with Lucca tribes of southern Anatolia. Historians still argue whether Lucca and Shekelesh refer to one people or multiple coastal groups, lumped together by scribes. A playful breeze carries the laughter of seabirds, as you imagine, upset, chiming in perhaps the Philistines, known to later Israelites. Excavations at Ashkelon and Ekron show Aegean-style architecture alongside local Canaanite pottery, hinting at a fusion of cultures. Scholars debate whether these Philistines were freshly arrived peoples or long-established coastal merchants adopting martial tradecraft. Historians still argue whether Peliset refers to a distinct invasion or gradual acculturation over decades. You pause to untangle your flip-flop from exposed olive roots, smiling at how unprepared beachgoers today and Bronze Age refugees share the same footwear woes. Nearby, a cluster of fragmented bronze rings lies half-buried. Some claim these are denying insignias, markers of unit identity stamped on weaponry. But the rings match Hittite girdle fittings, two blurring tribal distinctions. Historians still debate whether such artifacts represent sea peoples, symbols, or generic military hardware of the era. Glancing at the horizon where sky meets surf, you ponder the North African theory. Some fringe authors posit that the Sheridan or Shekelesh crossed from Libya's coasts, driven by desert drought into maritime banditry. They cite scant Berber burial, stele bearing vaguely similar war shields. Mainstream archaeologists counter that no North African burial population shift appears in 12th century BCE layers along the Libyan littoral. Historians still ask whether climate refugees from Sahara edges ever launched sea raids or remained landbound. Your finger brushes a chalky pebble as you recall the Jekkers' murky identity. Some link them to the Teucrians of Asia Minor, others to Cypriot settlers. One whimsical tale describes Jekker chieftains carving secret teetotems in Port Cavesan, exclusive code revealing hidden anchorages. No such totems survive, but cottage industry. Maps dotted with T-shaped rock carvings fuel TikTok treasure hunts. You follow a faint trail beneath low cliffs, trailing names like a guided tour of the unknown. Denayan, Peliset, Sheridan, they blur into a mosaic of shifting alliances rather than a single monolithic horde. Perhaps they were seasonal raiders joining forces for profit before dispersing back to homelands. Historians still argue whether sea peoples was a blanket term Egyptians used for any coastal threat rather than a defined ethnic confederation. As you retrace your steps toward a crumbled watchtower, the debate swirls. Were they exiles seeking new homes, professional mercenaries selling raiding expertise, or deposed elites striking back at neighbors? The lack of any self-descriptive inscriptions leaves us reliant on enemy records, an act of historical ventriloquism. You catch your reflection in a tide pool, faceless, unnamed, just like the raiders themselves. Yet each scrap of pottery, each helmet fragment, stations us closer to answering Nef, only partially who these sea peoples were. The contradictions preserve their power by embracing multiple origins. They embody the Mediterranean's cultural crossroads. Historians still argue whether narrowing their identity aids understanding or diminishes the legion of possibilities these mariners represent. You stand on the wet sand as the tide pulses in and out. Echoing the enduring question, the sea peoples remain ghosts of the sea, coalescing in our imaginations from every coastal whisper, every fragment of metal, every rumor of exile. No single answer emerges, but the debate itself, rising waves of interpretation, keeps their legacy alive long after their ships sank beneath the waves. You wander along a stretch of Mediterranean coast where limestone cliffs tumble into turquoise coves, and the breeze carries scents of wild herbs and salt. Here, in the centuries after their raids, the sea peoples left more than ruins. They seeped into the region's cultural bloodstream, shaping myths, languages, and legends that echo to this day. You pause at a hillside olive grove overlooking a cluster of ancient mounds where Philistine cities once stood. Mainstream archaeology confirms that the Palessa established a pentapolis Gaza, Skilon, Ashdod, Ekron, and Gath, introducing Aegean-style amphorae, hearth designs, and loom weights to Canaanite culture. Their pottery shards, painted with marine motifs, suggest they brought seafaring iconography ashore. Historians still argue whether Philistines blended seamlessly with local customs or largely maintained distinct coastal enclaves. A sudden gust rustles leaves, and you imagine shell-adorned dancers twirling in olive oil-slicked courtyards. Fringe. Chroniclers insist that sea peoples introduced an underwater cult of fish goddess worship that morphed into the cult of a tar goddess in Syria, where devotees carved mermaid icons from basalt. No temple inscriptions in Ashdod explicitly mention a tar goddess until centuries later. But the idea of ancient mermen priests slipping into kelp robes persists in late-night folklore podcasts. You step across a sun-bleached mosaic. It's tesserae, depicting dolphins and tridents. This seaside imagery survived in Greek myth. Scholars link early siren lore Hofbird, half-woman creatures luring sailors to Aegean stories adapted by coastal Canaanites. Some linguists even trace the word siren back to a Semitic root meaning sea whisper, suggesting cross-cultural wordplay. Historians still argue whether sirens sprang from sea peoples, oral traditions, or evolved independently in Homeric epics. A stray goat nibbles at tufts of thyme as you approach a weathered steely carved with concentric wave designs, a motif found on Philistine pottery and in Phoenician coinage. Modern numismatists note that later Greek coins copied these wave patterns, perhaps because merchants liked the look on their stater. If you laugh at the idea of millennial logo theft, no, you can't use our sea wave icon on your new Frappuccino cup. Your gaze drifts to a ruined shrine once dedicated to Dagon, the fish god worshipped by Philistines and mentioned in biblical tales. Mainstream texts from Ugarit describe Dagon as lord of grain and fish, symbolizing the fusion of land and sea. Historians still argue whether Dagon's worship arrived with sea peoples or predated their arrival, later gaining prominence through Aegean priest-kings promoting maritime fertility rites. You trace the sandstone walls where Semitic and Greek inscriptions overlap, a linguistic palimpsest of coastal multilingualism. Quotes from one Phoenician dedication read, "To Beelzebub, protector of fishermen," while a parallel Greek graffito declares, "Poseidon, guard our nets." This side-by-side epigraphy suggests sea peoples and locals negotiated divine portfolios, each community worshipping patrons of the deep. Historians still argue whether such multilingual shrines indicate peaceful cohabitation or uneasy coexistence under the threat of renewed raids. As you round a curve, a cluster of burial jugs stands half-buried in sand, funerary pots tinted with blue pigment and embossed with Aegean wave glyphs. These so-called Philistine churns held cremated remains, marking a cross-cultural burial rite. Fringe anthropologists propose a psychedelic twist, claims that the ash mixed with hallucinogenic plant extracts to guide souls to an undersea realm. No pollen scans confirm mandrake residues, but the wild theory crops up in YouTube deep dives on ancient psychedelia. You stroll past a ruined mosaic floor cracked by tree roots and time. Its central panel once portrayed a chariot drawn by hippocamp's legendary seahorses. Later Roman mosaics in nearby Antioch echo that design, bridging Bronze Age motifs to imperial art. Historians still argue whether hippocamp imagery migrated directly from Philistine artisans or spread via broader Hellenistic exchanges. A wind-blown scrap of papyrus flutters at your feet, painted with slender hieroglyphic strokes. Scholars recovered a fragment in Oxyrhynchus describing Philistine traders teaching Egyptians coastal navigation. Mainstream translations confirm that by the 11th century BCE, mixed crews of Egyptians and Philistines sailed Red Sea routes. Historians still debate whether this partnership arose from wartime alliances or commercial pragmatism after hostilities cooled. You pass a small fishing hamlet where locals still call themselves the sons of Japheth, evoking the biblical Japheth, said to father seafaring nations. This self-designation hints at a cultural memory tying present-day inhabitants to sea people's ancestors. Anthropologists note that folk lineages often adapt ancient legends to reinforce local identity. Historians still argue whether such lineages preserve real genealogies or are crafted myths for communal cohesion. Near sundown, you find a clifftop amphitheater carved into limestone, once used for sea-facing festivals. Ruins of stone benches ring the space where harpists and pipers likely performed Aegean melodies embroidered with Canaanite scales. Fringe ethnomusicologists claim that ancient notes survived in certain Maltese folk tunes. Case studies show curious glimpses of Ionian modes in Gozo lullabies. Without notation, it's impossible to trace exact tunes. Yet the cultural resonance feels palpable. Last Light catches a fragment of carved relief, depicting a fish-tailed figure presenting wheat to a humanitarian-looking goddess. You recognize echoes of this scene in later Hellenistic coinage, showing a triton holding grain, an icon of abundance. That blend of sea and sustenance suggests the sea peoples shaped Mediterranean imagery long after their ships sank. Historians still argue whether such motifs spread through itinerant merchants or via formal cult networks. You stand, waves crashing below, contemplating how migrations fueled a fusion of myth and language that lingers in the region's fabric. The sea peoples may have arrived as invaders, but their cultural legacy morphed into symbols of hospitality and plenty. Seaborne metaphors woven into local art and worship. In the hush of twilight, you realize they did more than destroy. Reshaped cultural currents, leaving ripples that course through the Mediterranean's living memory. You sink into your living room sofa, remote in hand, and fire up a documentary titled The Lost Ocean Warriors. Its glossy narration promising radical new insights into the sea peoples. Instantly, you're immersed in neon maps and CGI galleys, slicing through digital waves' modern interpretations of a Bronze Age mystery. The popular media's version of the sea peoples ranges from blockbuster epics to late-night conspiracy videos, each layering fresh spin on ancient ruins. Mainstream historians credit this surge of interest to the discovery of evocative sites, like Ashkelon and Medina Tabu, whose trace evidence invites cinematic retellings. In the documentary's first 10 minutes, you see reenacted raids with every spear glinting, every warrior in meticulously recreated horned helmets. That attention to detail stems from archaeological finds, real Shurden helmets displayed in museums, bronze swords unearthed from ash layers, and Hittite letters referencing pirates of the sea. Historians still argue whether these dramatizations exaggerate the scale of raids or accurately capture the fear they inspired. A fringe YouTube channel interrupts with a flashy thumbnail. Sea peoples, aliens of the Bronze Age. Its host claims that unusually advanced seafaring skills reveal extraterrestrial intervention raiders descending from orbiting motherships to teach humans naval tactics. You watch a shaky reenactment of glowing figures guiding raiders, complete with orchestral stings. No credible scholar supports this theory, yet it delights an online community convinced ancient astronauts shaped civilization. The alien claim may lack evidence, but it underscores our hunger for sensational explanations when the real story remains half-dash told. Next up, on a streaming platform is a high-budget series, Ocean's Edge, Age of Raiders, blending dramatized dialogue with solemn, expert commentary. A CGI sequence shows Peliset warriors disembarking at ash-kiln woven cloaks, bronze breastplates, and war chariots waiting in the dunes. The show credits the finest Egyptologists and maritime archaeologists, but intercuts a chapter claiming the Peliset were Nordic Viking precursors, based on a speculative genetic study showing shared haplogroups. You raise an eyebrow. While some genetic overlap exists across Eurasia, the context of Bronze Age population movements is far more complex. Historians still argue whether modern DNA can definitively trace migrations from Scandinavia to the Levant. On social media, a viral tweet asserts that the game Assassin's Creed Odyssey secretly features an Easter egg chamber devoted to the Sea Peoples, complete with a hidden mural depicting them. Gamers rally in forums to debate whether Ubisoft's creative license honors or distorts history. Popular gaming journalists note that while the game draws inspiration from Bronze Age artifacts, its narrative, twist, time travel, supernatural pieces of Eden push the Sea Peoples into mythic territory. Historians still argue whether such gamified renditions democratize knowledge or propagate misconceptions about ancient events. You switch to a podcast where host and guest one, a fringe self-styled maritime historian, debate the theory that Sea Peoples introduced democracy to coastal cities. They claim that displaced warrior bands settled ashore, toppling monarchic palaces and establishing council-based governance, later influencing Greek politics. Mainstream political historians dismiss this as anachronistic projection, yet the conversation ranks in the top 5 history charts. Historians still argue whether any post-invasion civic structures reflect genuine innovation or merely rebranded local systems. A quick TikTok clip surfaces. 3 signs your ancestors were sea people, pairing grainy imagery of rusted swords with modern DNA tests from at-home kits. Viewers post selfies with ancestral haplogroup labels, convinced they carry Sheridan or Denayan blood. Geneticists warn that consumer tests can't pinpoint specific Bronze Age tribes, but the idea persists. In our selfie-obsessed culture, the Sea Peoples become a symbol of rugged heritage and maritime prowess rather than complex historical actors. Historians still argue whether personal ancestry marketing trivializes its academic nuance or sparks genuine interest in deep history. On a niche blog, a writer argues the Sea Peoples myth inspired Wagner's Ring cycle, suggesting operatic sea nymphs trace back to Philistine legends. The post weaves poetic parallels but offers no direct citations, just evocative speculation. You skim. Comments. Some readers grasp at connections between Bronze Age storms and leitmotifs in romantic music, while others mock it as nerd earworm territory. Without archival links, the theory remains a creative flourish, yet it demonstrates how modern art continues to mine Sea Peoples imagery for fresh metaphors. You click on a secret Sea Peoples map PDF circulated in certain Reddit corners. It overlays modern satellite images with speculated ancient routes, drawing dotted lines from Cyprus to Libya, circles around the Balearics, and arrows reaching Iberian shores. The map's creator claims it uses gravity anomalies to pinpoint forgotten anchorages. Geophysicists scoff. Gravity data is too coarse for Bronze Age shipwreck location. Historians still debate whether mapping projections based on modern tech can validly reconstruct prehistoric seascapes. Late night, a friend texts you a link to a viral dance challenge. Steps named after Palessa, Sheridan, and Shekelesh performed to a remix of ocean sounds. You watch influencers shimmy as wave-like motions echo historic naval movements. It's playful and absurd, yet it highlights how ancient raids have morphed into pop culture fodder memes, dances, and digital remixes echoing Bronze Age tumult. Historians still argue whether popular reinterpretations honor historical complexity or reduce it to bite-sized entertainment. You sink further into the couch cushions. Shifting channels to a lecture by a respected academic on the Sea Peoples in global context. She emphasizes that the Sea Peoples represent universal themes: migration, source scarcity, cultural exchange, and warns against simplistic labels. She critiques both extremes: denial of invasions and fantasized alien theories. In her view, modern portrayals should balance rigorous scholarship with compelling storytelling. Historians still argue how best to communicate ancient enigmas in the digital age. You reach for your phone, its eyes heavy, and bookmark a half-finished video essay on Sea Peoples' influence on Mediterranean cuisine recipes for Sea Raider stew using olives, barley, and dried fish. The author imagines raiders teaching locals new cooking methods, blending Aegean and Levantan flavors. No ceramic residue confirms such culinary exchange, but you find yourself craving a bowl of salty broth. The line between fact and fantasy blurs deliciously at midnight. Your screen glows as you scroll through modern interpretations, museum VR tours, historical fiction novels, speculative documentaries. Each version refashions the Sea Peoples for contemporary appetites: epic warriors, alien invaders, democratic pioneers, cultural migrants. Some spark interest in genuine archaeology. Others draw mockery for overreach. Yet in every retelling, the Sea Peoples endure as vessels for modern imagination. You settle into a swivel chair at home and log into the latest virtual heritage app, where a holographic Sea Peoples galley materializes before viewers dipping in simulated foam, shields clattering in digital breeze. Welcome to modern interpretations of the Sea Peoples, where technology, tourism, pop culture remix Bronze Age history into experiences both thrilling and speculative. Mainstream archaeology now partners with tech firms to build augmented reality tours along the Levantine coast. At Ashkelon's waterfront, you slip on smart glasses that layer CGI raiding parties over real ruins, complete with scripted dialogue drawn from Hittite and Egyptian inscriptions. Visitors tap touch points on crumbling walls to trigger video maps of fleets converging on Ugarit. Historians still argue whether such high-tech reconstructions risk oversimplifying complex events or serve as gateways to deeper inquiry. Behind you, a wall-mounted exhibit features replica Sheridan helmets and rusted bronze swords recovered from underwater digs off Cyprus. Next to it, a 3D printed Sea Raider's dagger lets you feel the weight and balance. As narrated by a local curator. These interactive exhibits rely on mainstream finds-real metallurgy tests from Ashkelon show those daggers weighed under half a kilogram, optimized for stealth. Yet museum labels caution that no two artifacts share identical dimensions. Underscoring the variety within Sea Peoples toolkits, step outside, and you'll find guided Sea Raider walks along Turkey's southern coast. Tour operators dress you in linen tunics and strap foam rubber shields to your arm, leading beach landings at dawn to simulate amphibious insertions. Fringe tour blogs rave about authentic pine oil smoke and hidden catapult demonstrations, though professional guides admit that catapults are modern replicas tuned to safe tension levels. Historians still argue whether reenactments trivialize ancient violence or spark genuine historical curiosity. Crack open a craft beer bottle labeled Sheridan's Horn and you'll taste notes of local barley and wild thyme. Brewed by an Israeli microbrewery courting niche markets. The label sports stylized oared vessels and horned helmet logos. Quirky drinkers post rave reviews. Best rate in a glass since 1180 BCE. No yeast strain survives from 3,200 years ago, but the marketing ploy keeps the legend fermenting in. Bar trivia. On Netflix, you binge Raiders of the Bronze Age, K docudrama that blends expert interviews with dramatic recreations. K show's opening credits list consultants from leading universities, yet each episode inserts speculative scenes like a Sea People's Council draped in eelskin cloaks planning the Ugarit assault. The network bills it as history meets theater, but academics caution viewers, these scenes are conjectural. Historians still argue how to strike the right balance between engaging storytelling and evidentiary rigor. Meanwhile, a popular mobile game Coastal Conquest casts players as mixed tribe warlords commanding fleets of nub boats. You upgrade hulls, recruit mercenaries, and sack pixelated ports. Developers claim the game mechanics draw on primary sources ship capacities from Egyptian logs, troop numbers from linear B tablets, but they freely invent alliances and dialogues. Fans debate in forums over whether the Sheridan or the Jekker make better unit choices. Historians still argue whether gamified history fosters meaningful learning or fosters distorted mimetic echoes. If you prefer the open sea, join a Sea People's cruise out of Paphos. The itinerary includes snorkeling, over submerged Bronze Age wreckage, lectures on sonar mapping, and a live-action beach raid from hire-out longboats. Participants don recruits' garb, load replica bows, and volley arrows at floating targets. Some fringe enthusiasts glue squid ink stains to their bows for authentic invisibility prep, though crew members admit it just makes a mess. Historians still argue whether immersive tourism helps reconstruct ancient tactics or devolves into theme park spectacle. Academic conferences now feature Sea People's VR sessions where attendees don headsets to participate in digital excavations. You swipe virtual trowels to reveal amphora shards in underwater trenches and tag fragments for curated databases. The tech offers hands-on practice for students unable to join field digs, yet some senior archaeologists question if screen-based digs risk neglecting the feel of real clay and the complexity of stratigraphy. Historians still argue whether virtual excavation can replicate tactile learning or merely simulate discovery. Over on social media, a hashtag Sea People's DNA sparks conversations about genetic ancestry. Companies advertise Trace Your Sheridan genes kits promising lineage to Bronze Age migrants. Geneticists warn these tests can't distinguish Bronze Age subgroups. People end up with vague Mediterranean ancestry percentages. Still, the trend shows our craving for direct links to dramatic past episodes. Historians still argue whether genetic pop culture drives scholarly progress or spreads pseudo-science in academic publishing. New volumes compile underwater sonar surveys, isotope analyses of pottery glazes, and GIS-modeled seal veil changes during the late Bronze Age. These studies shape nuanced models of migration and maritime strategy. Yet each paper ends with the same caveat: data remain fragmentary. Further research required. Historians still argue which datasets merit priority textual, ceramic, or subsurface scanning, and how to integrate them into coherent narratives. Finally, look at UNESCO's tentative World Heritage List proposals for coastal ruins from Lebanon to Turkey. Local stakeholders lobby to list sites tied to Sea People's raids, hoping tourism revenue will fund conservation. Some communities embrace the raider identity. Others prefer neutral Bronze Age coastal settlements labels to avoid glorifying violence. Historians still argue how heritage designations should frame these sites as victims of invasion, laboratories of cultural fusion, or cautionary tales of climate and conflict. Whether you sip Sheridan's Horn Ale on a beach, recreate raids in VR, or snap selfies in Sheridan helmets at a kiosk, modern interpretations keep the sea peoples alive. They shift fluidly between rigorous scholarship and flamboyant fantasy, and maybe that's fitting. After all, the sea peoples themselves define neat categories. Today's tourists, gamers, and scholars carry forward an ancient saga rewritten by every generation's technologies and tastes. You stand atop a low bluff where the tide laps at your boots and the wind carries the distant cry of gulls. Below, the Mediterranean stretches into a pewter horizon, its surface untroubled now, but once roiled by sea people's galleys. The big question remains: did these raiders reshape ancient geopolitics, or were they merely adding chaos to a collapsing world? Mainstream scholarship notes that by toppling key coastal centers Ugarit, Skilana, Dortha, sea peoples triggered shifts in power balances that echo into the Iron Age, Egypt's new kingdom. Bruised by successive invasions, retreated from Canaan, ceding maritime influence to emerging Phoenician city-states. Historians still argue whether this withdrawal was a direct concession to sea people's pressure or a strategic refocus on Nile Valley concerns. In the vacuum, Phoenician mariners rose to prominence, laying the foundations of the Mediterranean's next trade networks. You can trace a straight line from the collapse of sea people's hit ports to Tripoli and Tyre's ascendancy in cedar timber and purple dye commerce. Some argue the sea peoples inadvertently catalyzed a golden age of Phoenician enterprise. Others see the shift as part of a broader Bronze Age continuity, troubled but not transformed by raiders. Historians still debate whether Phoenician hegemony was a direct consequence of Bronze Age devastation or a planned expansion. Military tactics evolved too. The sea people's lightning amphibious assaults forced empires to build coastal watchtowers, standardize patrol galleys, and stockpile naval defenses. Egyptian records from the Ramesside period include new inventories of riverine warcraft, designated to guard the delta's mouths. Fringe theorists even claim sea peoples invented an early magnetic compass using lodestone fish amulets to guide night raids. An idea no metallurgist has confirmed, but one that adds mythic sparkle to their ingenuity. Their economic impact was equally profound. By disrupting overland corridors and capturing or destroying caravan hubs, the sea peoples accelerated the pivot to sea-based trade. Archaeologists find coastal Cyprus exporting wine amphorae directly to Greece in the 11th century BCE pattern. Some attribute to merchant opportunism following Bronze Age land route collapse. Historians still argue whether maritime redirection stems from sea people's disruption or from broader regional innovations in shipbuilding and navigation. Culturally, the sea people's fusion of Aegean, Anatolian, and Levantian elements resonates in Iron Age art and language. The Philistine Pentapolis blended Greek-style megaron architecture with Canaanite cult practices, forging hybrid identities that appear in pottery motifs and personal names. Fringe linguists posit that early Hebrew borrowed certain maritime loanwords, like dagfish, from Philistine dialects, but mainstream philology finds scant textual proof. Historians still debate the depth of sea people's linguistic legacy versus gradual local evolution. On a strategic level, their raids underscored the vulnerability of coastal empires, spurring innovations in fortress design and naval logistics. The concept of rapid response coastal garrisons appears in Neo-Assyrian annals as a lesson learned from failed Levantine campaigns. Some claim this constitutes the sea people's most enduring legacy, a shift from bulk infantry warfare to amphibious readiness. Historians still argue whether these later practices derive directly from Bronze Age raids or parallel developments in statecraft. You look at the tiny pile of sea People's debris at your feet, bronze arrowheads, pottery shards, bone toggles, and realize even small bands of agile raiders left outsized ripples across geopolitical maps. Whether they intended empire building or simply sought plunder, their actions hastened the end of one era and set the course for the next. Their legacy resists tidy labels, part catalyst, part symptom of collapse. As you step back from the bluff, the sun bleaching rubble white behind you, you sense that the Sea Peoples did more than erase old orders. They opened space for new powers, new economies, and new cultural fusions. Their footprint on history is uneven and debated, but it endures in the Mediterranean's shifting currents of trade, politics, and art. Asterisk, you settle onto the warm stone of the bluff, letting the breeze soften your thoughts and the sea's rhythm lull your mind. Notice how each wave rolls in gently, then slips away, measureless and patient, reshaping the shore in subtle strokes. Breathe in the briny air and feel your shoulders ease as the weight of battles and betrayals drifts off with every exhale. The horizon stretches serenely before you, colors melding from pale gold to lavender. Let your gaze rest on that meeting of sky and water, where certainty dissolves into possibility. There, the Sea People's tumult fades into a distant echo, replaced by the timeless cadence of tides. Allow the gentle hiss of waves against the rocks to anchor you in this tranquil moment, comforting rather than chaotic. Recall the shards of Bronze Age pottery and the battered helmets. You encountered these, a reminder of lives once appended at sea. Now, let their stories soften into memory rather than disquiet. Their fierce raids, abrupt disappearances, and cultural legacies merge into the vast tapestry of human history, guiding you toward calm reflection. In this quiet, imagine the sea. Peoples sailing away beyond the horizon, their galleys swallowed by night, leaving no trace but ripples widening in still waters. Embrace the thought that even the mightiest storms eventually restitute peace. As your breath slows and your heart finds steady rhythm, know that you're part of a continual unbroken line from ancient strandings to present-day sunsets. Let the gentle hush of the Mediterranean guide you toward rest. Feel each wave like thought drift away, leaving only the soft pulse of water and wind. In this moment, you are both observer and participant in an ocean of stories floating, weightless and serene. Soon, eyelids will grow heavy, and you'll cross the threshold into dreams where salt water and starlight weave new tales. Sleep now, cradled by the sea's enduring hush, knowing that calm follows even the wildest tide. End of script. Sweet dreams.